Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the ACC Media Days, and my guy Anthony over here just asked a fantastic question that I will answer next week. I promise that I am getting to all of my predictions going into this year, and they will start next week, and we'll kind of work through all of the big conferences. But that all of those questions will be answered in that segment next week, so I promise you that. But don't want to spoil anything too soon. But let's get into segment two here, and let's talk about who's the most competitive conference. The conversation about who's the toughest conference, who's always battling, who's the best conference has been something that has been around for as long as I can remember. There are so many people battling for that top position, and it's often leaned towards the SEC, with the Big Ten being very close behind. I think we all understand that there is a level of football played at the SEC level that seems to be above the others, but is that really the case? Or at least, does being the best mean you are the most competitive? It honestly doesn't, and it's something that has really shown itself. Tom Fornelli did a fantastic job putting together all of this stuff from 2014 to now, leaving out the COVID year because that was a very weird year for a number of teams. So breaking down some of the different things, and one of the biggest things was how many close games do you play? How many one-score games do you find yourself in throughout the year? And there are a lot of teams that find themselves in one-score games. We'll start with teams and then we'll get into conferences here in a second. But let's start with the teams in the least amount of one-score games, and that could be for any number of reasons. So these are the games that you'll turn off late in the third quarter or early fourth quarter and go try to find something a little bit more interesting. And Rutgers leading this is not for the right reasons. I'll just put it that way. There are a couple of teams on here for the right reasons: Georgia, Ohio State, App State definitely, Michigan, Oregon. All of those teams are on here for the right reasons. Troy as well, another one. But the rest of them probably aren't on here for the right reasons. Probably are on here because they're not necessarily doing too hot during those later parts of that game. And Alabama just barely missed this list because, as you know, they found themselves in a couple of battles every single year, it feels like. And then you have Penn State, Tennessee, Arizona, SMU just off this list as well, or just off the top 10. So definitely some teams that absolutely blow out their opponents or don't do too well on Saturdays and people tune out of their games. But let's keep it moving here, and let's talk about the teams with the most close games over the last 6, 7 years. Oh my god, a decade. Wow, time flies. But let's break it down here, and it starts with Virginia. It feels like Virginia is always that team that plays up and down to opponents no matter what. North Carolina may be the best example of that, if I'm being totally honest. And then you have the team that I think everyone expected to be on here, Texas, and they absolutely have to fix that. They played 5 one-score games last year, so it took the percentage down, but it was not easy for them to deal with a lot of the games that they had last year, and it's going to be a problem as they go into the SEC if this continues to be the case, because there's less one-score games that you can come out on top on in the SEC than the Big 12, because in the Big 12, you had a little bit more ability to kind of just lean on your opponent, just kind of force them to quit at some point because you were bigger, because you were more physical, because you were stronger, and you had that ability. You won't in the SEC. So it'll be really fascinating to watch that. Nebraska is obviously going to be on this list. I feel like they're in a battle every single week. So that's definitely one. Kansas State being on here is fascinating because they just win those games. They continuously win those really close games. Hopefully they can kind of get a little bit further away from that this upcoming year, but definitely a really, really interesting one that I didn't necessarily expect to be there at the end of the day. So I think it'll be really, really awesome to watch all of this unfold. But here, let me check out what Anthony's asking here. Um, Yeah, I think there's a number of things that go into this. I think Texas is a team that has walked into a number of games just thinking that they're better. I think Miami could fall into that category, although I think there's a little bit, maybe a little bit less of that, although definitely could be present. I think Texas is the one that I would circle as the team that just shows up to some of those games, whether it's Iowa State or it's one of the lower level conference teams in the Big 12, and just says, we're bigger, we're stronger, we're more talented, we're going to win this game. And then they find themselves in a battle in the fourth quarter. So I think that would be the team that I would circle. But Miami absolutely is another one of those teams that might just toy around just a little bit too much with some of these lesser opponents. And let them stay in the game. I think that's what happened in the Georgia Tech game, where you make too many mistakes, you kind of are a little bit lackadaisical at times, and one mistake can absolutely ruin that game for you. So that's definitely a team that I would watch, and definitely something that kind of plays into this a little bit. But let's get into the conferences, because that's the big question everyone has. Who plays the tightest games in across all the conferences? Well, it's the two conferences that I peg to be the most competitive this upcoming season, the Big 12 and the ACC, in that order. The Big 12 is leading the way. They are number one among all FBS conferences, so among the 10 that are up for it, they are number one, and then ACC is number two. So they're both right around 42% of games that are one-score games, which is absolutely incredible. It gives you an idea of why those games are so much fun, and why I think the Big 12 is the conference to watch this upcoming season, because I think that percentage might just go up this season. It's going to be absolutely crazy out there. The FBS average is around 38%, so they're definitely well above that and playing some really, really tough football over there in the ACC and the Big 12. The SEC and the Big 10 find themselves on the other side of this. The SEC in 7th place among the FBS conferences, about 37%, and then Big 10 all the way at the bottom at 10th in the conferences, 35%-ish for them playing those one-score games. So it kind of gives you an idea of how these conferences are structured a little bit. It's a little bit more the SEC and the Big Ten being defined by the big guys, and then everyone else kind of just fighting for that second or that third spot. And then you have the ACC and the Big 12, where it's just any given Saturday, just show up, lace them up, and we'll figure out what happens on the other side. But let's go to the inverse of this. Who has the most blowouts? Who has the most games that are won by 17 plus points? At least that's the way that Tom Fornelli broke it down. And same exact thing. ACC is number one, 37.67% of their games are blowouts, so not very many. Obviously, a lot of those come from Clemson over the last little bit, but definitely a very, very high moniker, or low moniker is what you want for this, but definitely a very, very interesting thing, and absolutely is something that really ACC and can really hang their hat on. And then the Big 12 is not far behind them. They're third among all FBS conferences, about 39-40% here. The FBS average is right over 40% at 41.5. And then you have SEC and Big 10 in the exact same places they were before. Big 10 or SEC 7th among FBS conferences, and Big 10 dead last. So a lot of blowouts in those two conferences, and it breaks down just how the exact same thing that I just said here. It's definitely a very, very interesting thing to watch when you talk about these conferences, where the Big 12 and the ACC are a little bit more unpredictable and a little bit more closer and competitive every single week. Does that make them the better conference? I tend to believe no. I think there is a difference between who's the better conference and who's the more competitive. But at the end of the day, if you were to ask me, do you want to watch Georgia facing off against Tennessee, but Georgia wins by 17 and is up by 17 going into the fourth quarter, or do I want to watch Kansas State play Arizona and it goes down to the wire and someone wins it with a last-second kick? I'm picking the latter 10 times out of 10. So that is something that the ACC and the Big 12 can kind of hang their hat on. Obviously, it's not necessarily the greatest thing when you go into these rooms where you kind of have to pitch yourself as big brands, and you have to pitch yourselves as, you want to pitch the Georgias of the world. You want to pitch the Alabamas of the world. You don't necessarily have quite as much traction if you're pitching Clemson, who might be on the way down, or Florida State, who might be on the way out of the conference. And then in the Big 12, you have some teams that hold a little bit of weight, but not nearly the weight of the others in the Big 10 and the SEC. Like, Utah is a fantastic program, but if you put them in the same room as Texas, you're not fighting the same battle, and Utah is going to win that 10 times out of 10. So I think that's kind of the conversation here is, I tend to believe that the SEC and the Big 10 are the two best conferences in this sport, but part of me believes, that's not what makes this sport special, right? It's not about who's the best conference. It's not about who are the best teams in the country. It's not about, how many teams can absolutely just separate themselves from the pack. for me, it's about those games that go down to the wire, those nail biters, the ones that you're sitting on the edge of your seat, even if you don't care about the two teams playing in it, because it's that interesting. The one that comes to mind most readily is that Missouri-Kansas State game from a year ago, where just every single drive felt so important and so intense. And it's one of those games that obviously was out of conference, so applies a little bit less here, but definitely is something that the Big 12 has kind of been known for over the last little bit, and it's helped out that someone like Texas has been playing down a lot of the time. But the reality is, it is kind of just a preference more than anything else. You know, do you want to watch just elite athletes run all over the field and make ridiculous plays and possibly end the game up 21 like you find in the SEC a lot of the time? Or do you want to take just that slight step down? And it's really a very slight step. I understand the gap between them is growing, and it feels like they're playing two totally different sports, but there's some really, really good football being played in the Big 12 and the ACC, and if it's really competitive too, then I'm all for it. So I think it's kind of one of those interesting conversations, because best and most competitive are two totally different conversations, but competitive and interesting are directly correlated. So that's why I point to the Big 12. That's why I point to the ACC this upcoming year as the conferences to watch, because they might not just be the most interesting games in the world, but there's going to be a game. Maybe it's Syracuse, Virginia Tech. I don't even know if they play, but let's just throw that out there. That could be a game that goes down to the last very second, because the ACC is just a little bit more unpredictable. So it's kind of that interesting battle of who's the best, who's the most competitive. Frankly, doesn't necessarily matter to me. As long as you're giving me good football, I'm all on board. So definitely would be a very interesting thing to follow over the next couple of years and see if the SEC and the Big Ten, with some of the new people coming in, can kind of close that gap, or if the ACC loses some teams, maybe that gap even gets a little bit bigger, or maybe it comes back down to earth. Who knows? So it'll be really, really fascinating to watch. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Texas A&M. It feels like the Aggies are being just a little bit overlooked, but frankly, I think that's the way that Mike Elko and the Aggies like it around this time of year. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.